What if the moon's mysterious magnetism, or Venus's bizarre backward spin and scorching heat aren't just cosmic quirks, but direct evidence that our solar system endured violent global cataclysms in recent human history?
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the complex, the controversial, and the just plain mind-blowing and unpack it using the sources you provide.
And today, oh boy, are we diving deep.
We really are. Today, we are tackling a truly monumental and, let's just say it, radical body of work by Immanuel Velikovsky. We're drawing specifically from Earth and Upheaval and Worlds in Collision, diving deep into the claims he made in those books, along with insights from related texts like Mankind and Amnesia and Velikovsky Reconsidered.
These aren't light reads, are they? They are dense, challenging, and they absolutely shook the scientific world when they first came out.
Oh, definitely.
The sheer scope of his synthesis, pulling from geology, astronomy, ancient history, mythology, it's a lot to take in.
It really is.
But that's what makes it so potentially profound, right, when someone tries to connect all those dots.
Absolutely. And our mission in this deep dive is to explore Velikovsky's central, incredibly controversial claim that Earth has experienced recent global catastrophes on an almost unimaginable scale, driven by encounters with other planets.
And not just any planets, but specifically Venus and Mars, acting very differently than they do today.
Exactly. And that these events happened within human history. We'll look at the geological evidence he presented, the astronomical arguments, and even the historical and psychological dimensions.
And importantly, we'll examine the idea presented within these sources. This is key. That his theories initially met with, well, let's be honest, fierce opposition.
Understatement of the year.
Right. That these theories have actually been supported, maybe even proven correct in some aspects, by later scientific discoveries. That's the narrative we're exploring today, based purely on this material.
It's about presenting the narrative as these sources lay it out. It's a story that suggests we might need to fundamentally rethink Earth's history and our place in the cosmos.
It's quite the challenge to the established view, isn't it? The comfortable, slow, gradual picture of the past.
Definitely. So get ready for a wild ride. We're going to approach this with totally open minds, connecting dots across disciplines that you might never have considered.
We'll keep it conversational, enthusiastic, try to make sense of this incredible, world-altering picture Velikovsky painted.
Think of us as your guides on this intellectual adventure, sifting through this incredible stack of documents he put together.
It challenges a lot of deeply held assumptions, which is where the real fascinating insights often lie, isn't it? When the evidence doesn't quite fit the comfortable box.
Couldn't agree more. Now, before we dive in, a quick note. Hey everyone, if you're enjoying this deep dive, do us a solid and hit that like button. It really helps us bring these explorations to you.
Seriously, it makes a difference.
And if you want to join us for future deep dives into fascinating and sometimes mind-bending topics, please subscribe and definitely ring that notification bell so you don't miss a single one.
You won't want to miss what's coming up.
Okay, let's unpack this incredible stack of sources and see what story they tell about Earth's tumultuous past and the forces that shaped it. We're starting with Earth in Upheaval, which really grounds the argument in the physical evidence found right here on our own planet.
Yeah, this is the bedrock, literally, of his argument.
Right. The big picture here, according to Velikovsky, is a direct challenge to the prevailing view of geology, which is known as uniformitarianism.
That's the standard idea, isn't it? That geological changes happen slowly and gradually over vast periods of time. The principle is the present is the key to the past.
Meaning the slow processes we see today, like erosion and sedimentation, are enough to explain everything if you just give them millions and millions of years.
Exactly. Slow and steady wins the race, geologically speaking. That's the mainstream view.
Right. It's about immense time and tiny, steady changes. Velikovsky argues, using the evidence presented in this book, that the geological record tells a very different story. One of sudden, violent, global catastrophes, what's often called catastrophism.
And this wasn't a completely new idea Velikovsky just invented out of thin air. The sources remind us of earlier geologists, like Georges Cuvier back in the early 19th century.
Oh, yeah. What did he find?
Well, Cuvier was studying fossil bones near Paris, and he couldn't help but notice evidence of not just one, but multiple widespread extinctions and violent revolutions of the globe, as he put it.
Revolutions, like the whole world turned upside down.
Kind of. Events that seemed to wipe out entire groups of species before new ones suddenly appeared in the rock layers above. His observations made it really hard to argue for purely gradual change.
So he saw breaks, sudden changes in the fossil record?
Exactly. He laid some groundwork for the idea of sudden, massive events, even though gradualism eventually became the dominant paradigm in geology.
Cuvier saw these layers of different life forms, abruptly stopping and starting, like chapters ending violently in Earth's history. And Velikovsky picks up on that thread with some of the most striking evidence presented in the sources, the frozen dead and mass burials of animals.
Ooh, yeah, this is where things start being purely academic and start getting really, really weird and, frankly, mind-blowing.
Totally. We're talking about animals that died suddenly, violently, and on a massive scale, and were then often rapidly buried or frozen before decay could even set in.
Which is crucial. The preservation is key.
The Siberian mammoths are the classic chilling example. The sources describe these incredible findings: perfectly preserved mammoths found encased in ice, their flesh intact.
So well preserved that early explorers apparently sometimes tried to eat the meat, which is wild.
I know, right? And the crucial detail: undigested food plants and grasses that do not grow in northern Siberia today still in their stomachs and even between their teeth.
Think about what that means for a second. They weren't slowly trapped in a bog and then frozen over winter.
Get away.
They were killed and frozen almost instantaneously. One source quotes a geologist from the late 19th century saying the cold became suddenly extreme, as of a single winter's night, and knew no relenting afterward.
As of a single winter's night. That's terrifying.
If they had died slowly or frozen gradually, the bodies wouldn't be so perfectly preserved, right? And the stomach contents would be digested. It points to an incredibly abrupt, lethal environmental shift, like unimaginably fast.
Suddenly, extreme cold, just bam, everywhere, killing massive animals instantly. And it wasn't just Siberia. The sources describe similar, equally perplexing findings in Alaska.
Ah, yes, the Alaskan muck.
Vast beds of this frozen sludge containing dismembered and torn animals. Mammoths, mastodons, lions, bears, all jumbled together with tree trunks buried in this frozen muck.
It sounds horrific, like everything just got thrown into a blender and then frozen solid.
Pretty much. And the sources highlight something interesting here. Explorers notice the striking similarity between the Alaskan and Siberian remains: the sudden death, the weird mixing of animals and trees, the frozen muck.
But they didn't really connect the dots.
Apparently not. They didn't really discuss a common cause. It's almost as if the conventional explanations, like, local glaciers, animals falling into bogs, just couldn't encompass both vast regions and the sheer violence implied by the remains.
So Velikovsky suggests a common global cause was needed. Something huge.
Exactly. And it gets even bigger. We're talking about animal cemeteries on a truly colossal scale, heaps of bones found all over the world.
Like bone graveyards.
Yeah. The New Siberian Islands, for instance, are described in the sources as having hills, actual hills, 250 to 300 feet high, made of driftwood, and the skeletons of pachyderms, that's elephants and mammoths, rhinoceroses, and buffaloes.
Oh, hills of bones and driftwood. 300 feet high?
That's what the sources report. Pachyderms and rhinos mixed with huge tree trunks, hundreds of feet high.
Okay, that's not a gradual accumulation. That sounds like a massive flood deposit or something.
That's the idea presented. These massive cemeteries were formed by animals and trees being violently swept together, perhaps by immense tidal waves, and deposited in jumbled masses, not neat layers over millennia.
Just chaos, basically. Solidified chaos.
And then there are the cave deposits, like those studied extensively in England and Gibraltar. You find bones of incredibly diverse animals mixed together, carnivores and herbivores sharing the same space.
Which is weird in itself. Lions and hyenas don't usually hang out with deer and hares.
Right, and the list is wild. Lions, hyenas, bears, rhinoceroses, hippopotami.
Hold on, hippos? In England?
Yes, hippos in England. Found in caves alongside reindeer and other species from totally different climates, plus deer, hares, just all mixed up.
Okay, that needs explaining. How did they get there?
Well, again, the condition of the bones is key, according to the sources. They're often broken and splintered, but not worn down by water over time, and crucially, not gnawed by predators.
So they weren't dragged in there by hunters or scavengers.
Probably not. The sources argue this isn't evidence of animals seeking refuge in caves, which would be highly unusual behavior for many of these species anyway, especially hippos trying to climb into a cave.
Yeah, I can't picture that.
Instead, it suggests they were swept together by massive forces, maybe those same immense tidal waves, and violently dashed against rocks or cave walls.
Ugh. It's a picture of sudden, violent death and catastrophic mixing on a huge scale.
And one more example, the La Brea tar pits in California. Famous site, right?
Yeah, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves.
Exactly. The sources highlight the incredible density of remains there, averaging 20 saber-toothed tiger and wolf skulls per cubic yard.
20 skulls per cubic yard. That's insane.
Along with bison, horses, camels, giant sloths, mammoths, mastodons, even peacocks, all trapped together.
It's a snapshot of a huge, diverse animal population being trapped and killed together repeatedly over what some interpretations suggest was a relatively short geological time frame.
And the sources compare that density to the relatively sparse animal life in that area today, highlighting how unusual this concentration of dead megafauna is.
It requires some mechanism that could gather and kill vast numbers of animals across different habitats, either all at once or in rapid succession. Something far beyond normal predator-prey cycles or slow environmental change.
So the geological evidence in Earth in upheaval, as presented in these sources, starts building this picture of a planet where sudden, violent global death and burial were maybe commonplace events, not rare exceptions.
It paints a very dynamic, very dangerous picture of the recent past.
But it's not just animals, it's the land itself changing places with the sea, rapidly.
Right. This is where you find one of the most persistent puzzles for gradualist geology. Marine shells and fossils found not just near coastlines, but way up high on the highest mountain chains on Earth.
Like the Alps, the Andes, the Himalayas, you find seashells up there?
Absolutely. Seashells, fossils of marine creatures, found thousands upon thousands of feet above current sea level.
Darwin himself, the father of gradual evolution, observed marine shells high in the Andes and noted it indicated significant uplift from the ocean floor.
He did. And the sources point to this as evidence that massive land masses that were once under the sea were rapidly raised up thousands of feet to become mountain peaks.
And the key word there is rapidly. This isn't presented as happening over millions of years, bit by bit, but on a scale and speed that points to powerful sudden forces.
Forces strong enough to lift continents.
And the flip side of that coin, evidence of land areas now submerged deep under the sea.
Like lost lands, Atlantis.
Well, maybe not Atlantis specifically mentioned here, but areas like the Dogger Bank under the North Sea. The sources mention clear evidence of Mesolithic and Neolithic human settlements, places people lived that are now deep underwater.
So people were living there, and then suddenly, or very quickly, the sea covered it.
That's the implication. That land didn't just slowly erode away or subside gently over millennia. Its submersion happened relatively recently within human history, indicating a significant and rapid change in sea level or crustal elevation.
Wow. Land up, land down, very quickly.
And places like the gypsum beds of Paris show multiple layers, indicating not just one flood, but repeated returns of the sea to that area.
So it wasn't a slow, one-way process of land rising or falling. It's described as multiple rapid inundations, back and forth.
Which again challenges the idea of slow, continuous processes shaping the landscape over vast, unchanging eons, doesn't it?
Certainly makes you wonder.
This leads directly into evidence of violent Earth movements, tectonic activity on a scale we rarely imagine today, and happening relatively recently, according to these sources.
Yeah, think mountain building. The sources argue that major mountain ranges like the Cordilleras in the Americas, the vast Alps, Caucasus, Central Asian system, and the Himalayas,
the biggest mountains on Earth,
experienced uplifts of thousands of feet within the Pleistocene epoch, what we commonly call the Ice Age, and crucially, even during the Age of Man.
Wait. Mountains rising thousands of feet while humans were potentially walking around, like geologically recent.
That's the claim presented in the sources. It seems completely incompatible with the idea of slow, gradual geological change over millions of years.
That's like watching the Rockies sprout in real time.
Exactly. The sources state this fact caused great perplexity among geologists who are trying to fit it into a gradualist framework. It just didn't compute.
And Darwin's observation of excessively disturbed strata, like really messed up rock layers in the Cordillera, also suggested extreme violence, far beyond what slow, uniform processes would cause.
Yeah, it looked like the Earth had been violently churned, not gently folded over eons.
And rift valleys, like the Great Rift Valley in Africa.
That whole system, actually, stretching for 1/6 of Earth's circumference from Syria down through Africa, the sources link its formation to these last great mountain uplifts.
So they happened around the same time.
Suggesting it formed in one or more great tensions. Like the Earth's crust was literally torn apart in one or a few massive events.
A single or a few great tears in the Earth's crust, stretching immense distances, formed in connection with massive mountain building. Again, the scale and implied speed point away from slow, accumulating stress.
And toward a sudden global event or series of events that violently stretched and fractured the planet's crust.
Okay, what about erratic boulders? Those massive stones, sometimes the size of small houses, found miles from where they should be, often uphill.
Ah, the erratics. Yeah, they're weird. Before the Ice Age theory became dominant, these were often attributed to massive tidal waves, the so-called diluvium, or flood deposits.
The Great Flood, basically.
Kinda, yeah. Then the Ice Age theory explained them as being carried by vast glaciers and just dropped when the ice melted.
Which makes sense for some, maybe.
For some, perhaps. But Velikovsky's sources suggest a different mechanism, or at least a different cause for the ice and water action that transported them. They argue these boulders were broken off mountains in huge numbers when ice and water were thrown into action from stressed, heated, or shattered mountains.
So not just glaciers slowly scraping along, but mountains being violently broken apart, maybe by earthquakes or impacts, and then immense quantities of ice or water, perhaps massive tidal waves of cosmic origin, doing the transporting.
That's the interpretation presented in the sources.
Yeah.
A much more violent origin story for the erratics.
Examples.
Examples given include massive boulders in Vermont and Quebec, apparently cast there by an erupting ocean, rocks carried from Norway all the way to the Carpathians in Eastern Europe.
Well, that's a long way.
From Mount Blanc in the Alps to the Jura Mountains, from Labrador in Canada down to the Poconos in Pennsylvania.
So they crossed valleys, went uphill.
The sheer volume and distribution, the fact they crossed valleys and went uphill, are highlighted as evidence of extreme, widespread forces that traditional geology, relying solely on continental glaciers, struggles to fully account for in all instances. It points to something bigger, something more powerful.
And finally, in this picture of Earth's upheaval, volcanic activity, and evidence of things falling from the sky.
Yeah, the sources mention incredibly thick volcanic deposits, like 20,000 feet of volcanic tuff that's consolidated ash near Lake Superior.
20,000 feet thick. That's almost 4 miles of ash.
And vast quantities of lava flows, 24,000 cubic miles in one area alone. These figures suggest volcanic activity on a scale far, far exceeding what we see today.
Pointing to periods of immense geological turmoil and heat coming from within the Earth.
And the ocean floor deposits they found not just ash and lava down there, but also significant quantities of iron and nickel.
Which isn't typically volcanic.
Not in those quantities in distribution. The sources link the presence of iron and nickel specifically to celestial showers and meteorites, suggesting extraterrestrial material fell to Earth on a massive scale.
And maybe that's what caused the tectonic ruptures and internal heating that led to the vast lava outbursts, a connection between impacts and volcanism.
That's the proposed link. The sources also mention widespread fields of scorched and broken stones, oraz in Arabic, and large meteorite fields, like the Wobar crater in Arabia, as direct evidence of intense heat and extraterrestrial impacts or new impacts that coincide with these periods of terrestrial upheaval.
So the geological trauma on Earth isn't seen in isolation in these sources. It's potentially linked to violent events happening above us in the sky.
Exactly. It connects the Earth's turmoil to cosmic events.
Okay, so Earth in upheaval, as presented in these sources, paints this picture of a planet that has recently been subjected to global violent transformations, sudden freezing, massive floods, rapid mountain building, vast volcanic outbursts, and extraterrestrial bombardment.
It's a far cry from the tranquil, gradual evolution of uniformitarian geology. It really demands a different explanation, doesn't it?
It really does. It's the physical foundation upon which Velikovsky builds his larger case. The geological evidence, in his view, doesn't just suggest catastrophes. It absolutely demands them as the primary sculptors of our modern landscape.
And that explanation requires a different sense of time. If mountains rose thousands of feet recently and animals were instantly frozen, maybe the standard geological timelines aren't quite right either.
Good point. Which brings us to the puzzle of time. Velikovsky's sources challenge the long timelines often assigned to geological features, suggesting they might be much younger than commonly thought, aligning with the more recent catastrophic history.
Exactly. Conventional geology needs vast eons, millions, tens of millions of years for those slow, gradual processes to shape the landscape we see.
But if sudden global catastrophes happened, then features could form, change, or even disappear very quickly, right?
Precisely. You wouldn't need nearly as much time.
The prime example given in the sources is Niagara Falls. We think of it as ancient, right?
You'd assume so. but the sources cite research, specifically by a geologist named W.A. Johnston.
What did Johnston find?
He calculated that the falls cut their present channel, the gorge below the falls, in less than 4,000 years.
4,000? That's incredibly young. What were the older estimates?
Much, much longer, sometimes over 30,000 years. The sources note the protracted discussion and controversy this much shorter date caused. It really challenged the established long timelines.
So a feature assumed to be ancient turns out to be remarkably young, geologically speaking.
And similar findings are mentioned for St. Anthony Falls on the Mississippi River.
Same story there. Younger than thought.
Yeah, work by N.H. Winchell initially gave a figure for its gorge formation that was considered much too low. And later research showed that massive floods associated with melting ice sheets significantly increased the rate of erosion, pointing to rapid channel cutting, potentially within a much shorter time frame than originally assumed.
So, faster erosion, younger features. Makes sense if things were more energetic.
Exactly. And then there were the massive glacial lakes, these huge bodies of water that formed at the edge of retreating ice sheets during and after the last ice age.
Like Lake Agassiz in North America was huge, right? Bigger than all the Great Lakes combined.
Immense. That one, and also the Great Basin lakes in the western U.S., like Lahontan in Nevada, Chihuahua in Oregon. Research cited in the sources suggested these lakes formed, filled up, and then dried up or shrank significantly within just the last few thousand years.
Not tens of thousands of years ago?
No, much more recently.
Yeah.
For instance, research by I.C. Russell and others suggested Lake Lahontan, that huge lake covering much of Nevada, existed and dried up within a time frame as short as 3,000 years.
3,000 years for a lake bigger than states to appear and disappear.
That's the finding presented. And Van Winkle's analysis of the saltiness of Lakes Chihuahua and Abbott Summer in Oregon suggested an age of only about 4,000 years since their post-glacial origin.
Wow. And crucially, what did they find in the sediments of these recent lakes? You mentioned this earlier.
This is a critical point presented in the sources. They found bones of extinct animals, mammoths, camels, horses, and human artifacts, spear points, tools.
So humans were living alongside these extinct megafauna near these massive lakes that formed and dried up, potentially just a few thousand years ago.
That's the implication. It suggests humans were present and coexisting with now extinct megafauna very recently, and that the major geological processes affecting these vast lakes, their formation and disappearance, were happening within that same recent human time frame.
So the sources highlight how these findings on lakes and waterfalls drastically shorten the estimated length of the post-glacial period, sometimes to as little as 3,000, 4,000 years.
Which directly challenges the long-held timelines of conventional geology, which usually places the end of the Ice Age much, much further back, maybe 10,000 or 12,000 years ago.
This ties back beautifully to the sudden extinctions we talked about earlier. The sources reiterate the point that entire species and genera disappeared globally suddenly.
Right. Cuvier noted this puzzle centuries ago, and even Darwin struggled with what he called the apparently sudden extermination of whole families or orders. It didn't quite fit his gradual model.
How did Darwin explain it?
He attributed it to the incompleteness of the fossil record, basically arguing that the transitional links, the slow dying out phases, were simply missing, lost to erosion, or never fossilized.
Makes sense as an argument, but how do Velikovsky's sources counter this?
They counter that the pattern observed what Darwin himself called the simultaneous change of life forms globally across geological strata is actually strong evidence for sudden global events, not against them.
Because it's happening everywhere at once.
Exactly. It's presented as a pattern that is hard to reconcile with purely gradual processes and slow natural selection impacting different regions at different rates, especially when you see diverse, widespread ecosystems disappear almost in lockstep across the planet.
And the sources also highlight an oddity, that many large animals that apparently survived the harshest part of the Great Ice Movement seem to die out right at its end.
Yeah, that's weird, isn't it? You'd think the worst point would be the deadliest. Why die off when things are supposedly getting better? It's highlighted as a puzzling detail that requires explanation beyond simple climate change or gradual extinction.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, but still related to Earth's history and potential instability, the sources also discuss another puzzling phenomenon recorded in ancient rocks, Earth's magnetic field reversing its polarity.
Yes, paleomagnetism, the study of the Earth's past magnetic field locked in rocks. It provides clear evidence of these reversals happening throughout Earth's history. North Pole becomes South Pole, magnetically speaking.
But the cause of these sudden flips,
That's presented as unknown in many standard scientific contexts. And the sources note that these rapid reversals contradict cosmological theories based solely on gravitational forces and a slowly cooling Earth core generating the field through a dynamo effect. A slow dynamo shouldn't just suddenly flip, right?
Yeah, seems counterintuitive. And the sources mention something about the strength.
Yes, the astonishing strength of magnetization locked into some rocks with inverted polarity. It's sometimes much stronger than the current Earth's field could imprint.
So the rocks remember a time when the field was not only reversed, but maybe much stronger.
That's one interpretation presented. This residual strength also needs an explanation.
So what was Velikovsky's take on these magnetic reversals?
Well, in both Worlds in Collision and Earth in Upheaval, he suggested these reversals could be caused by an interplanetary discharge, like a giant lightning bolt between planets, or the overwhelming influence of an external, powerful magnetic field from a closely approaching celestial body, like his proposed Venus or Mars encounters.
So an external influence messing with Earth's magnetism.
Exactly. Which could also, he suggested, cause the Earth's axis of rotation to change position or direction.
Tilt the planet, make it tumble.
Essentially, yes, knocking the Earth off its axis or causing the poles to shift location relative to the crust.
Wow. Is there any evidence for that?
Well, the sources connect this idea to the observation that the Earth's pole of rotation isn't perfectly stable even today. It currently describes a small circle in the sky, the Eulerian circle, often called the Chandler wobble.
So the Earth wobbles slightly.
Yes, and this slight ongoing wobbling, as the sources call it, is presented as potentially pointing to a past, larger displacement of the poles, a residual effect of being knocked askew by an external force sometime in the past.
Like the Earth is still slightly unstable, still settling down after being hit or significantly perturbed.
Precisely. That's the analogy used. And the sources bring in research by people like H.E. Sues and others who looked at discrepancies in radiocarbon dating calibration curves.
Radiocarbon dating, how does that relate?
Well, the amount of carbon-14 produced in the atmosphere depends on cosmic rays, and the Earth's magnetic field shields us from cosmic rays. So changes in the magnetic field strength affect C14 production, which can mess up the dating if you assume the fields was constant.
I see.
And Suze and others concluded there were radical changes in the Earth's magnetosphere intensity around the second millennium BCE, roughly 1500 BCE or so.
And when did Velikovsky say his big Venus encounters happened?
Around that exact same time, the second millennium BCE. So this period of intense magnetic field variation inferred from radiocarbon data is presented in the sources as being in striking harmony with Velikovsky's claims about catastrophic events occurring precisely at that time.
Okay, let's recap this section. You have geological evidence for sudden, recent global upheaval. You have hints from waterfall and lake dating suggesting much shorter timelines for geological features than previously thought. And now you have evidence from the Earth's magnetic field that might point to sudden, powerful external influences recently disturbing the planet, possibly even tilting it, around the same time Velikovsky proposed major planetary encounters.
It all starts to build a consistent picture, doesn't it? A picture based on the evidence presented in these sources of a very different, much more chaotic recent past than the one taught in standard textbooks.
It definitely lays the groundwork for looking outside of Earth for the cause of these massive synchronized changes. You need a mechanism powerful enough and global enough, right?
Exactly. Which brings us neatly to Section 3, Celestial Mechanics and Electrifying Possibilities. How do we explain all this chaos?
Before Velikovsky proposed his explanation involving planetary close encounters, how did scientists try to explain some of these puzzling facts, especially the Ice Age, which seems to be a key recent event in this narrative?
Well, the Ice Age theory itself, really pushed by Louis Agassiz in the 1830s, gradually gained traction. It explained things like the drift deposits, those erratic boulders, and polished rock surfaces as the result of vast ice sheets covering large parts of Europe and North America.
So glaciers explain the weird rocks and scraped bedrock.
That was the idea. But initially, it faced significant resistance from leading geologists who actually favored the earlier diluvium or massive tidal wave explanations for all that transported material. They thought giant floods made more sense.
Interesting. But the Ice Age theory won out eventually. Did it explain everything, though? The sources suggest it faced significant challenges and contradictions based on other evidence.
Absolutely not. The sources list some real head-scratchers for the simple Ice Age model. Like, how do you explain the widespread evidence of tropical plants and animals found in what are now polar regions?
Yeah, you mentioned coal beds and fossils of things like elms, hazels, and even water lilies found way up near the North Pole in Spitsbergen. That's bizarre.
Totally bizarre. And conversely, how do you explain the presence of hippopotami, lions, and other warm climate animals found in Europe and Alaska in the same geological layers as Ice Age fauna like mammoths and reindeer?
It's like the climates got completely scrambled globally and very quickly. A massive, rapid shift that seems too abrupt and widespread for simple glacial advance and retreat caused by gradual climate cycles.
You have warm weather species and cold weather species jumbled together globally, and polar animals like reindeer found as far south as New Jersey or the Crimea in Ukraine. It's not just things moving, it's environments changing drastically and species mixing in ways that defy slow climate zone shifts.
And you also mentioned geological features that the sources argue should have been destroyed by immense ice sheets grinding over them if they really covered everything.
Right, like delicate spires of rock observed standing intact in places like Siberia and Arctic islands that were supposedly buried under miles of ice. The ice should have flattened them.
Good point. The theory also struggled to explain the precise mechanism for the start and end of such a massive glaciation, and, crucially, the rapid warming-cooling transitions needed to kill and freeze those mammoths so suddenly.
Exactly. The transitions into and out of the Ice Age and the rapid shifts within it posed significant problems for models based on slow, uniform processes, like changes in Earth's orbit, the Milankovitch cycles. They don't seem powerful or fast enough to explain the evidence.
So, if the standard Ice Age theory wasn't a perfect fit for all the evidence, what other explanations were considered for past climate changes or shifting poles based on purely internal Earth changes?
Well, there were theories about the Earth's poles shifting location over time due to the gradual redistribution of land and sea masses through erosion, sedimentation, and slow tectonic shifts. Like if continents moved around, maybe the balance would change and the Earth would tilt.
Did that hold up?
No. Astronomers and physicists rejected these ideas, calculating that such slow internal processes couldn't displace the poles enough or quickly enough to cause an ice age or explain the other global upheavals.
Not enough energy, basically, generated from within the Earth itself to tilt the planet or cause such massive crustal changes.
Pretty much. Not enough oomph, as you said earlier.
Okay, what about the sliding crust theory? The idea that the outer shell of the Earth slid over the inside.
Yeah, this theory was proposed by people like Arthur Eddington and Alfred Wegener, who's famous for continental drift. They suggested the Earth's outer lithosphere, its crust and upper mantle, slid over its deeper interior, maybe due to tidal friction from the moon or gravitational differences caused by uneven mass distribution.
Could that explain the climate shifts and mountain building?
Again, the sources present this theory as also quantitatively inadequate. The forces involved tidal friction, gravity differences were seen as too weak. It needed a more powerful motive agent than these relatively gentle, gradual internal forces to explain the scale and speed of mountain building and global disruption observed in the rocks.
Okay, so internal Earth processes, pole shift from mass redistribution, sliding crusts, don't seem sufficient, according to these sources, to explain the scale, speed, and synchronized global nature of the changes observed in the geological record.
Which leaves to what?
This is where Velikovsky comes in with his radical hypothesis from worlds in collision.
His central argument, the one that truly shocked the scientific establishment, is that these recent global catastrophes were caused by near collisions with other celestial bodies, not just random meteorites hitting us, but planets.
Specifically Venus and Mars, which he argued were not in their present stable orbits in the past. They were moving erratically.
And he focuses on two major series of these events described in ancient texts and correlated with the geological evidence happening in the second and first millennia BCE, roughly 3,500 and 2,800 years ago.
Which is very recent in geological terms. That's Bronze Age and Iron Age history.
Yes, linking the physical evidence of global catastrophe directly to human historical accounts and traditions from around the world. And he proposed that Venus was a young planet, perhaps even a comet, that was somehow ejected from Jupiter.
Ejected from Jupiter, like spat out.
That was his proposal, based on interpretations of myth and astronomical considerations.
Right.
And this young, chaotic Venus then had encounters with Earth and Mars before gradually settling down into its current nearly circular orbit.
Okay, that is a wild idea. Venus as a comet from Jupiter.
Absolutely. And this idea of Venus as a recently active, hot body, perhaps even a comet, leads to some really surprising points the sources highlight as evidence supporting Velikovsky, often based on discoveries made after his books were published in the 1950s.
Like what? What did later science find that seemed to fit?
Well, the extreme heat of Venus is a key one the sources point to. When radio astronomers first turned their telescopes to Venus in the late 1950s and early 60s, they were shocked.
Why? What did they find?
They discovered via radio emissions that the planet has a surface temperature of around 600 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe even hotter. The sources note this was much higher than anyone would have predicted based on standard solar heating and greenhouse effect calculations at the time. Venus is closer to the sun than Earth, but not that much closer.
So it was way hotter than expected.
Way hotter. And Velikovsky had predicted this high temperature back in 1950, hadn't he? Based on his theory.
He had. He argued it was residual heat from its recent violent birth or ejection and its tumultuous past encounters, not just sunlight and CO2.
That's exactly what the sources claim. They present Velikovsky's view that this intense heat wasn't fully explainable just by a standard greenhouse effect from its thick atmosphere, especially given Venus's very slow rotation.
Why does the slow rotation matter?
Because with such a slow spin, one Venus day is longer than its year, you'd expect enormous temperature differences between the side facing the sun and the side facing away, like hundreds of degrees difference. But the night side is almost as hot as the day side.
So the heat is distributed evenly, suggesting it's coming from the planet itself, not just the sun.
That's the argument. Shapiro's point on this is mentioned in the sources. Venus is described in the sources as a heat reservoir that was recently filled by its formation or cosmic events and hasn't had time to cool down yet.
Okay, that's prediction number one. The sources claim came true. Unexpected heat. What else?
The atmospheric composition also plays a role. We know it's mostly CO2, very little water vapor, thick clouds of sulfuric acid. But the sources also touch on the controversy around hydrocarbons, things like methane or petroleum compounds.
Did Velikovsky predict those too?
He did. He suggested Venus might have hydrocarbons in its atmosphere, possibly having originated from Jupiter's atmosphere if Venus was ejected from there, since Jupiter is rich in that stuff.
And did they find them?
Well, this was a major point of contention. Early infrared spectra in the 60s didn't find a key absorption feature for hydrocarbons, and a paper by Plummer in Science is mentioned as an explicit contradiction of Velikovsky's prediction at the time. This was seen as a major blow against his theory.
So a failed prediction.
Initially presented as such, yes.
Yeah.
But the sources also mention later points suggesting hydrocarbons might actually be present in Venus's upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, possibly being cracked or broken down by strong electrical discharges in Venus's atmosphere.
So maybe they're there, but hard to detect or in a different form.
That's the suggestion. And sources note that even mainstream astronomers like Gerard Kuiper mention hydrocarbons as theoretical possibilities for Venus later on. The sources also point out the instability of hydrocarbons in Venus's harsh, hot environment as a factor in why they might be difficult to detect or persist near the surface. So according to the sources, it wasn't as clear-cut a disproof as initially presented. It's more nuanced.
Okay, interesting. Now, you mentioned something truly mind-bending earlier, potential evidence of past water or even granite on Venus.
Yes, this is perhaps one of the most striking pieces of evidence presented in the sources, and it came much later. The sources mention data from the Galileo spacecraft flyby in 1990. It used near-infrared spectroscopy to look at the surface through windows in the clouds.
And what did it see?
A Japanese team led by Hashimoto interpreted some of the signatures from highland regions, like Aphrodite Terra, as being consistent with potential granite.
Granite on Venus, that's huge, isn't it? Because granite formation on Earth requires liquid water and processes linked to plate tectonics and continental crust.
Exactly. Finding possible granite on Venus implies a very different past environment for the planet, one that might have had significant water and maybe even continents, starkly contrasting with the current hellish, dry volcanic conditions.
So if true, it means Venus wasn't always like this.
Precisely. The sources frame this potential finding as strongly supporting a radical change from a potentially more Earth-like past on Venus, aligning perfectly with Velikovsky's narrative of it being a young, recently formed or transformed body that wasn't always in its current state. It's a huge puzzle for the standard view of Venus as an ancient, dry planet that formed hot and stayed hot.
Wow. Okay, that's a big one. What about the idea of Venus having a cometary past? Any evidence for that?
Well, Velikovsky proposed Venus was comet-like in its early stages after ejection from Jupiter. And the sources bring up an unexpected discovery from the Pioneer Venus orbiter data, also around 1990. Scientists found unexplained variations in Venus's electron environment way out far from the planet.
Weird electrical stuff happening around Venus.
Yeah. Larry Brace's findings. The explanation they came up with was a dynamic process involving a stream of electrons being torn away from Venus's upper atmosphere by the solar wind, the stream of charged particles from the sun.
And this stream of electrons forms what?
It forms what acts like a comet tail of electrons trailing behind Venus, leading to phenomena like Kelvin-Helmholtz instability, basically waves or turbulence in this electrical tail.
So Venus has a tail, just an invisible electrical one?
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
And the sources present this discovery of a detectable dynamic tail effect as a tangible remnant effect associated with a mythical cometary tail, potentially supporting the Venus as a comet idea Velikovsky proposed, even if it's an electrical tail, not the dust and gas tail we usually associate with comets.
So unexpected heat, hints of hydrocarbons, potential past granite and water, and a literal comet tail of electrons. The sources are presenting these later discoveries as aligning with Velikovsky's initial highly criticized claims about Venus being a young, recently chaotic body.
That is precisely the argument presented within these texts, that science, decades after his books were published, found things about Venus that seemed to fit his seemingly wild predictions, things that were unexpected from the standard viewpoint.
It makes you think. But what about the biggest hurdle? The orbital changes. Planets just bouncing around the inner solar system like billiard balls. Classical celestial mechanics based on gravity and inertia alone seems like a huge obstacle. It predicts immense stability over vast timescales.
You've hit the nail on the head. This is acknowledged, even in sources sympathetic to Velikovsky, like Velikovsky Reconsidered, as the weak link, or the biggest challenge when viewed solely through the lens of classical physics, like Newtonian gravity.
Because planets just don't do that kind of thing according to those rules, right? They conserve energy and angular momentum. Their orbits shouldn't change dramatically without some massive accounted-for force.
Exactly. Classical celestial mechanics strongly favors orbital stability over vast timescales. Planets getting knocked around recently is basically heresy, according to that model.
So how do the sources that support Velikovsky address this seemingly insurmountable problem? Do they just ignore physics?
No, they don't ignore it, but they question its completeness in this context. They present the view that traditional celestial mechanics, based only on gravitational and inertial forces, might be inadequate for describing these extreme catastrophic events.
Meaning gravity isn't the whole story.
Possibly. They suggest that powerful unknown forces like electromagnetism might play a crucial role during periods of close planetary approach, especially if the planets carry significant electrical charges.
This is where the electrical universe ideas come in?
Right. The section on orbital dynamics in Velikovsky Reconsidered explores various possibilities, like maybe the Earth also being in a highly elliptical orbit previously, making encounters more likely, and the complex exchange of angular momentum that would be needed. But ultimately, the sources argue that explaining the transition from chaotic orbits to the final stable orbits we see today based only on gravity is highly problematic, implying other forces must have been involved to dissipate energy and circularize orbits so quickly.
So this is where the idea of celestial bodies being charged comes in, leading to powerful electromagnetic interactions during close passes, not just gravitational ones pulling them.
Exactly. This is a core part of the proposed alternative physics presented in the sources. They argue that if planets are charged, then during close encounters, the electromagnetic forces could be vastly stronger than gravity and could account for the rapid orbital changes, the intense heating, the axial tilts, and other phenomena.
What evidence do the sources offer for planets being charged or electromagnetism playing a big role in space?
They point to several things, again often discovered after Velikovsky wrote. 1. The unexpected discovery of powerful radio emissions from Jupiter in the 1950s. This is presented as confirming Velikovsky's prior expectation, based on myths linking Jupiter's Zeus to thunderbolts, that Jupiter would be a strong source of radio noise due to powerful electrical activity, like massive lightning storms or discharges in its atmosphere. Mainstream science was surprised by this discovery.
So Jupiter is electrically active. What else?
Evidence for Earth's magnetic field potentially being linked to electric charge flowing through the planet, drawing on early ideas from physicists like Henry Rowland, is also mentioned.
Our magnetic field might be electrical in origin.
That's one idea explored. Also, evidence for the sun itself being charged and emitting the solar wind of plasma, a stream of charged particles, is presented as supporting Velikovsky's earlier suggestions about the electrical nature of the sun and interplanetary space. Space isn't empty, it's filled with plasma.
And cosmic rays.
High-energy charged particles hitting Earth from space are also brought up, suggesting Earth is constantly interacting electrically with the cosmos and potentially collecting a net positive charge.
So the argument is that space is fundamentally electrical, and ignoring that misses a huge piece of the puzzle.
Precisely. The sources argue that the very precision of gravitational theory in describing the current stable orbits doesn't necessarily invalidate the idea of electromagnetic forces playing a crucial, perhaps dominant role during periods of close proximity and instability, especially within the plasma environment of space.
They quote the physicist Hannes Alfvén.
Yes, Nobel laureate Hans Alfvén, a pioneer in plasma physics, who argued that plasma often doesn't behave according to theories developed for neutral gases, and that electromagnetic forces are crucial on cosmic scales. His work is cited as supporting the kind of physics needed for Velikovsky's scenario.
And the concept of electrical discharges shaping the universe.
Yeah, the idea of a breakdown of electric fields shaping galaxies and stars, drawing on earlier work like that of electrical engineer Wilfred Bruce, is mentioned as a larger theoretical framework, often called the electric universe model, within which these planetary interactions, driven by powerful electrical forces, might occur.
So Velikovsky's hypothesis, as presented in these sources, isn't just about planets moving around differently. It's potentially about a fundamental reevaluation of the forces at play in the cosmos. It's suggesting that electromagnetism needs to be included alongside gravity to fully understand celestial dynamics, especially during chaotic periods.
That's the core argument made in these supporting sources. It suggests that if you ignore potential electrical forces between charged celestial bodies, you might be missing a crucial element in understanding not just planetary history, but the dynamics of the solar system, especially during periods of close approach and interaction. It's a paradigm shift in thinking about space.
Okay, we've covered the Earth upheaval, the time puzzles, Venus, the orbital mechanics debate, and the role of electromagnetism. What about other players, Mars and the Moon?
They're definitely part of the narrative presented in the sources. After the major Venus encounters around 1500 BCE, Velikovsky proposed that Mars, whose orbit was also perturbed, had its own series of close encounters with Earth, primarily in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE.
So, a second round of chaos, but this time with Mars.
Yes, causing further catastrophes described in texts from that period, like the time of Isaiah in the Bible or Homeric descriptions. The sources discuss Mars's orbit potentially changing significantly as well.
And the Moon, how does it fit in? Did it get hit too?
The sources suggest the Moon played a role and was definitely affected. Velikovsky argued the Moon's heavily scarred surface might be much younger, or at least heavily modified by these recent events, not solely the result of impacts billions of years ago.
Younger stars, any evidence cited for that?
Well, the most striking evidence presented is the unexpected discovery of remnant magnetism in the moon rocks brought back by the Apollo missions.
Moon rocks are magnetic. I thought the Moon didn't have a magnetic field.
Exactly. Astronomers expected the Moon, having cooled slowly over billions of years without a liquid core dynamo like Earth's, to be non-magnetic. But the rocks showed significant residual magnetism.
How did mainstream science explain that?
It's still debated, often involving theories of a short-lived ancient dynamo or transient fields during impacts. But the sources present Velikovsky's interpretation. The Moon was exposed to powerful external magnetic fields from close passes of Earth, Venus, or Mars, and intense heat causing surface melting recently, which allowed the rocks to acquire magnetism.
So the Moon's magnetism is presented as evidence for recent exposure to heat and external fields, fitting his catastrophic timeline.
That's the argument made. And another lunar puzzle mentioned is the finding of excess noble gas atoms like argon and neon implanted in the outer layers, the very surface, of moon rocks.
Weird gases on the Moon, where did they come from?
Their origin and distribution were puzzling. Velikovsky, via chemist A. Bergstaller, cited in the sources, suggested these gases might actually be of Martian origin, swept up by the Moon during close passes with Mars, when Mars might have temporarily had a denser atmosphere or was outgassing due to the encounters.
Martian air on the Moon.
That's the speculative possibility presented as a way to explain their presence and concentration near the surface, fitting the narrative of recent planetary interactions.
And the Moon's orbit itself. Anything weird there?
The sources mention a point raised in a sky and telescope commentary. The Moon's current orbit is actually quite unusual for a satellite. It's inclined relative to Earth's equator, and it's not perfectly circular.
Most moons orbit flat around the equator. Right?
Often, yes, especially if they formed with the planet. The commentary suggests the moon's tilted, somewhat eccentric orbit could be more easily explained if it experienced a close encounter with another massive body relatively recently, perturbing it from a possibly simpler, earlier orbit.
So even the moon's path might be a scar from these events.
It's presented as another piece of circumstantial evidence, potentially supporting the idea of recent perturbations in the Earth-Moon system.
And the sources even mention ancient accounts, like the Arcadians in Greece calling themselves proselenes or pre-lunar people.
Yes, Velikovsky discussed this in his Earth Without a Moon concept, suggesting these ancient traditions might indicate a time, perhaps before the current moon was captured or settled into its orbit, when Earth either had no moon or a different one. Again, highly speculative, but part of the narrative woven from ancient texts.
Okay, so the argument presented is that the physical state and orbit of the moon, like Venus and Earth, also bear witness to recent cosmic upheaval.
That's how the sources connect the dots.
We've looked at the overwhelming geological evidence for chaos and sudden change, the astronomical evidence pointing to recent planetary encounters, especially involving Venus and Mars, the moon's potential role and scars, and the hints of alternative physics involving electromagnetism playing a key role. Now let's turn to the human dimension, because Velikovsky's work isn't just about rocks and planets, it's also about us. Section 4, Mankind in Amnesia, the psychological dimension.
Right. This is where his book Mankind and Amnesia comes in, and it's arguably as controversial as Worlds in Collision. He tries to use psychological theories to explain humanity's response to such terrifying existential events.
What's the core idea?
The core idea is that ancient texts, myths, and folklore from all around the world are not just fanciful stories or primitive science. He argues they preserve deep, traumatic memories of these planetary catastrophes.
So myths are like fossilized memories of real, terrifying events.
That's the concept. Velikovsky started this whole line of inquiry, the sources say, by noticing striking similarities between ancient Egyptian texts, like a document called the Admonitions of Ippur.
What does that describe?
It describes a time of terrible upheaval in Egypt. The Nile turning to blood, darkness covering the land, the earth shaking, plagues, social chaos. Sound familiar?
Sounds a lot like the plagues of Egypt in the biblical Exodus story.
Exactly. Velikovsky saw this incredible correlation between the Ippur papyrus and the Exodus account, both describing similar widespread plagues, cosmic signs like pillars of fire and smoke, rivers turning foul, darkness over the land, and earth tremors.
And he thought they were describing the same event.
Yes. That correlation was a key starting point for Worlds in Collision, suggesting these were not isolated local events, but historical records from two different cultures of a single massive global or near-global catastrophe, which he linked to the first encounters with Venus.
Wow. And the sources list other examples from around the world showing this isn't just limited to Egypt and Israel, right?
Oh yeah, it's presented as a global pattern. Chinese accounts from the Qinchu chronicles describing stars falling like rain, mountains collapsing, and the earth shaking, which Velikovsky correlated with strange phenomena reported in Roman cult rituals happening around the same time, linked to the later Mars encounters.
What else?
Greek myths and epics like the Iliad, describing battles between gods like Athena and Mars interacting that caused Mount Ida to shake violently and rivers to literally boil.
Gods fighting, causing earthquakes and boiling rivers? Sounds like metaphors for something real.
That's how Velikovsky interpreted them. Also, the apocryphal Book of Enoch's vision of heaven collapsing onto the earth being swallowed up and mountains being suspended over a fiery abyss. Or Apostle Peter's description in the New Testament of the heavens and earth being reserved unto fire and the elements melting with fervent heat at a future judgment, which Velikovsky saw as reflecting past experience projected onto the future.
So these aren't presented as just isolated myths or religious prophecies. The sources frame them as widespread, cross-cultural memories and descriptions of celestial phenomena and terrestrial chaos on a global scale.
Using similar motifs and language, cosmic battles, fire, flood, darkness, earthquakes, strange celestial bodies across continents, pointing to a common, shared experience of cosmic and terrestrial terror.
Okay, so if these events happen, if they're recorded in myths and legends globally, why isn't this front-page news in every history book and geological textbook? Why the disconnect?
That is the central question addressed in Mankind and Amnesia. This is where Velikovsky's psychological hypothesis comes in, drawing heavily on early psychoanalytic ideas from Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung.
How does psychology explain this?
The core idea, borrowing from trauma psychology, is that events of such magnitude, global, terrifying, existential, threatening the very continuation of life, are simply too much for the human psyche individually and collectively to bear consciously.
Too traumatic to remember.
Exactly. It can lead to individual and, more importantly, collective amnesia, a massive repression of these unbearable memories from the conscious, shared mind of humanity.
Like psychological defense mechanisms working on a planetary scale for our entire species.
In essence, yes. The sources mention Freud's early work on how individual trauma can lead to amnesia, the forgetting of unbearable events, and his later, more speculative concept of racial memories, the idea that traces of profound ancestral experiences might be inherited.
And Carl Jung's ideas fit in here too.
Yes, Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, a shared inherited layer of the unconscious mind and archetypes, these universal inherited patterns of thought and imagery found in myths and dreams worldwide, like the Great Mother, the hero, the apocalypse.
But Jung didn't really explain where those archetypes came from, did he?
No, the source notes Jung described them as inherited pre-existent forms, but didn't specify the experiences that created them.
So Velikovsky's idea, as presented in Mankind and Amnesia, connects these psychological dots.
Exactly. He proposed that the planetary catastrophes were the overwhelming traumatic source of these repressed racial memories and the raw material for the archetypes. They are the deep, buried experiences that shape the collective unconscious, leaving humanity with a deep-seated, often unconscious residue of cosmic terror.
And what's the consequence of this profound, species-wide repression? Does it just go away?
Psychoanalytic theories suggest repressed trauma doesn't just vanish. It often leads to a compulsion to repeat the trauma, albeit symbolically or in displaced forms.
How would that manifest?
The sources discuss this. It could manifest in myths and rituals that obsessively reenact cosmic battles, destruction, and creation stories. Or perhaps even in modern anxieties. The source specifically discusses H.G. Wells's later, increasingly apocalyptic writings, suggesting they might stem not just from rational prediction of future wars, but from a deep, inherited terror of global destruction bubbling up from the unconscious. The fear of atomic war, for example, might tap into this older, deeper fear.
So our history, our heritage, isn't just what's written down.
According to this view, humanity's heritage is transmitted in two ways. Consciously, through written and oral history, which can be incomplete or distorted, and powerfully, perhaps more powerfully, unconsciously, through this racial name, this inherited memory trace of chimal terror.
That's a profound idea, and the sources present the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle as a fascinating case study through this psychological lens.
Yeah, this is a really interesting argument. They suggest that Aristotle's entire philosophical system, his strong emphasis on gradual change in nature, natura non facit saltus nature does not make leaps, his insistence on the absolute fixity and perfection of the celestial spheres, his dismissal of earlier Greek accounts of past global upheavals.
He basically created a very stable, predictable model of the universe.
Exactly. And the argument presented is that this system might have served, perhaps unconsciously, as a deep-seated psychological defense mechanism, an intellectual effort to soothe a profound, possibly inherited terror of planetary catastrophes and a chaotic, unpredictable cosmos. He built an intellectual fortress against the fear.
That's a remarkable claim that one of the foundational figures of Western thought, whose ideas shaped science and philosophy for centuries, could have built his system partly out of a subconscious denial of traumatic cosmic history.
It certainly reframes intellectual history, doesn't it? And it also serves to frame the fierce, often irrational-seeming opposition Velikovsky faced when he presented his ideas 5 decades ago.
You mean the resistance wasn't just scientific disagreement?
The sources suggest it was potentially also a powerful, collective psychological resistance, a manifestation of this very amnesia, this deep-seated unwillingness to acknowledge that something so terrifying could have happened, something that directly contradicts the comfort of a stable, predictable cosmos and a history of slow, manageable change. We don't want to remember.
And the intense, often very unscientific reaction he faced is well documented in the sources, right?
Oh, absolutely. The struggles to get Worlds in Collision published after the original publisher, Macmillan, buckled under pressure from prominent academics like the Harvard astronomer Harlow Shapley.
What kind of pressure?
Threats of boycotting Macmillan's widely used textbooks if they published Velikovsky. It was intense. Then there was the organized, discrediting campaign, the firing of Gordon Atwater, the curator of the Hayden Planetarium, simply for planning a show based on the book, academic boycotts, attempts to suppress his work.
It sounds less like scientific debate and more like a witch hunt.
It was an extraordinarily intense reaction, going far beyond typical scientific disagreement. The sources quote Shapley's strong statements against Velikovsky, calling his work nonsense and demanding its suppression, even questioning his intellectual integrity. It highlights the emotional, almost visceral reaction his ideas provoked.
But the sources also present contrasting anecdotes, suggesting not everyone reacted that way.
Right, like Albert Einstein, who apparently kept worlds in collision on his desk when he died, heavily annotated. And crucially, Einstein was willing to help Velikovsky formulate tests for his ideas, like the prediction about Jupiter's radio noise. Einstein apparently suggested how it could be tested shortly before his death.
So Einstein at least was open-minded.
He's presented in the sources as having the open mind of the authentic scientist, willing to consider radical ideas and, importantly, test them, even if they seemed outlandish.
Any other examples?
The sources quote a note from H. Hess, a prominent geologist and chairman of the Space Science Board during the early space age. Hess corresponded with Velikovsky, acknowledging his sincerity and vast information, but stating their fundamental philosophical difference. Hess wrote, "We do not accept each other's form of reasoning logic."
Wow. So it wasn't just about facts, it was about a fundamentally different way of thinking about the evidence.
Exactly. It highlights the deep paradigm clash Velikovsky represented. It wasn't just about interpreting data. It was about connecting disparate fields, mythology, geology, astronomy, in a way that mainstream science wasn't equipped or willing to do.
And even later, more even-handed views are mentioned.
Yes, like astronomer J. Doral Mulholland, writing in the popular magazine Sky and Telescope years later. He argued Velikovsky's claims should be addressed seriously because he used observation and real planets, not mysticism, and that simply dismissing his ideas as absurd isn't good science, given that the history of science is full of ideas initially considered absurd that turned out to be true.
So the sources frame this intense resistance, at least in part, as a reluctance, maybe an unconscious collective one, driven by that amnesia to revisit a terrifying possibility that humanity has collectively repressed because it shatters our sense of security and stability in the universe.
It's a compelling psychological layer added to the scientific debate.
Okay, bringing it all together now. Section 5. Connecting the dots. Has Velikovsky been proven correct? This is the big claim we mentioned at the start, presented within these sources. How do they argue this?
Well, they synthesize all the threads we've discussed. First, the overwhelming geological evidence presented in Earth in upheaval for sudden global changes. The frozen mammoths, the mixed bone beds, the rapid mountain uplifts, the marine fossils on mountains, the submerged lands, the massive floods, the erratics, the immense volcanism, all pointing away from purely gradual processes and strongly towards massive, rapid, catastrophic events reshaping the planet.
Okay. The Earth evidence demands catastrophe.
Second, these earthly events are presented as being directly connected to the astronomical proposals in worlds in collision, near collisions with other planets, particularly Venus and Mars, which were argued to be out of their current stable orbits relatively recently within human history.
The cause was cosmic encounters.
And third, and this is the crucial part for the proven correct argument within these sources, they present specific physical evidence discovered after Velikovsky published his books, especially as the space age began, as unexpected confirmations of his specific claims or predictions.
Predictions made years earlier based on his synthesis of ancient texts and his challenging interpretations of physical evidence available at the time.
Exactly. Claims that extinctions often ran directly counter to the prevailing scientific consensus of the 1950s.
Okay, let's quickly reiterate some of those key later discoveries that the sources highlight as aligning with or supporting Velikovsky's views according to these texts. You listed them before. Let's run through the big ones again.
Sure. According to the argument presented in these sources, 1. Venus's extreme heat. Predicted by Velikovsky, unexpectedly confirmed by radio astronomy and probes.
Yeah.
2. Jupiter radio noise. Predicted by Velikovsky based on myth, unexpectedly discovered by radio astronomers.
Check.
3. Moon magnetism. Unexpected remnant magnetism found in Apollo rocks, presented as fitting Velikovsky's scenario of recent heating and exposure to external fields.
Check.
4. Moon's noble gases. Excess gases found near the surface, presented as possibly Martian in origin, fitting the close encounter scenario. 5. Venus's potential granite water. Later infrared findings suggesting possible granite, implying past water and continents, presented as supporting a radical change in Venus's past, aligning with Velikovsky's narrative.
Big one. Check.
6. Venus's comet tail. Discovery of an electron tail torn off by solar wind, presented as a remnant effect supporting a past cometary phase.
Check.
7. Earth's magnetic field changes. Radiocarbon dating anomalies suggesting major magnetic field fluctuations around 1500 BCE, presented as harmonizing with Velikovsky's timing for Venus events.
Yep.
8. Short geological timelines. Findings on Niagara Falls, glacial lakes, etc., pointing to formation or major changes within the last few thousand years, presented as shortening conventional timelines and fitting a recent catastrophe model.
Right.
9. Evidence for extraterrestrial material. Iron nickel on ocean floors, meteorite fields, presented as evidence of past massive celestial showers linked to catastrophes.
Yep.
10. Anomalous volcanic activity. Evidence of past volcanism on a scale far exceeding today's rates, presented as supporting internal heating triggered by external events.
Got it. That's quite a list.
It is. And the sources are explicitly stating that these unexpected findings in geology, planetary science, and space physics support his theories and predictions, even if the mainstream scientific community doesn't accept his overall model or the proposed causal mechanism, like ejection from Jupiter or electromagnetic forces dominating.
So the argument isn't necessarily that every single detail of his proposed mechanism is right, but that the outcomes he predicted, the state of the planets, and Earth's history seem to align remarkably well with later discoveries.
That's a fair summary of the position taken in these supportive sources. They focus on the successful predictions, or expectations, as validating the core thesis of recent planetary catastrophes.
So, the central thesis presented in these texts is that despite the initial lack of acceptance, the fierce opposition, and the unconventional nature of his interdisciplinary approach, Immanuel Velikovsky's work synthesized evidence from disparate fields to propose a historical narrative of recent planetary catastrophes that is not only consistent with numerous long-standing geological puzzles, but has also seen several of its specific expectations confirmed by later scientific observations and discoveries as presented within these sources.
Precisely. That's the narrative constructed by Velikovsky and supported by the authors and evidence compiled in texts like Velikovsky Reconsidered.
And the psychological dimension, the idea of collective amnesia surrounding these terrifying events, helps explain why the scientific community and humanity might be so resistant to accepting this evidence, even when later findings seem to support aspects of it.
Yes, it frames the intense negative reaction itself as potentially part of the phenomenon. Velikovsky described a deep, perhaps unconscious need to keep these terrifying possibilities repressed from collective awareness.
The sources quote the publisher's preface from Paradigma Ltd., which reprinted some of these texts.
Right, noting that studying the history of Velikovsky's reception teaches us not only about science and its processes, but also, from a psychological point of view, about our understanding of ourselves, our collective response to profound threats and paradigm shifts.
So the resistance is seen as potentially more than just rational scientific skepticism.
It's presented as also being influenced by deeply ingrained psychological factors, a fear of confronting a traumatic past.
So what does this whole saga, this history of Velikovsky's ideas and their reception, teach us about science itself, according to these sources?
It highlights several things. The inherent resistance to fundamental paradigm shifts, especially those that challenge core assumptions about stability and time.
How hard it is to break free from established frameworks.
Exactly. Like celestial mechanics based solely on gravity and inertia, or geology based solely on gradualism. And it highlights the potential for non-scientific factors, including psychological resistance, institutional pressures, personality clashes to heavily influence the acceptance or rejection of uncomfortable truths or radical new ideas, even when evidence emerges that seems to support aspects of them.
So it's a story about the limits of established science, in a way.
The sources portray it as a struggle between an established view that prefers gradualism and stability, and a challenging view, supported by a different reading of the evidence and later discoveries, that points to a recent, terrifyingly chaotic past. It questions whether the scientific establishment is always open to truly revolutionary ideas, especially those that come from outside the standard disciplinary boundaries.
It really makes you think about how we define what is scientifically acceptable, how new ideas that overturn fundamental beliefs are received, and how the scientific consensus can sometimes be, well, dogmatic or resistant to change, even in the face of puzzling data or unexpected discoveries.
It's a powerful lesson in the sociology and psychology of scientific progress, or perhaps resistance to progress when ideas are just too disruptive to the status quo.
Wow. This deep dive has certainly been a journey. We've covered the overwhelming geological evidence for sudden global change presented in Earth in upheaval,
The frozen mammoths, the mixed-up bones, the mountains rising quickly.
the astronomical findings about Venus, Mars, and the Moon that, according to the sources, align in striking ways with a catastrophic narrative.
The heat of Venus, the moon's magnetism, Jupiter's radio noise.
And the compelling idea from mankind in amnesia of a collective human amnesia surrounding these events, which might also help explain the intense reaction Velikovsky's work received.
It challenges our fundamental understanding of Earth's history, the stability of the solar system, the forces at play in the cosmos, and perhaps even the human psyche's capacity to repress terrifying truth.
So what does this all mean for you, listening right now? It asks us to consider whether the world we see today, with its seemingly stable orbits and gradual geological processes, is the whole story.
Or if it's the scarred survivor of cosmic violence that happened within human memory. Violence that we, perhaps, are still collectively unconsciously processing or trying desperately to forget.
It's a profound challenge to our standard worldview, isn't it?
It really is. It's a powerful invitation to look at the evidence presented in these sources and reevaluate assumptions that are deeply ingrained in our modern understanding of the Earth and the cosmos. It suggests the story might be far more dramatic and far more recent than conventional science currently allows.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you a shortcut to understanding this truly fascinating and, let's face it, incredibly controversial body of work. We've aimed to provide you with the surprising facts and the narrative connections presented in these sources.
Connecting the dots across different fields of knowledge, from frozen mammoths to potential Venusian granite, from ancient myths about boiling rivers to modern discoveries about magnetic field reversals.
It's about exploring the possibility, based on the argument within these sources, that humanity's deepest fears of cosmic chaos might actually be rooted in real, terrifying historical experience, not just ancient superstition or imagination.
A heavy thought, but a fascinating one.
Definitely. And to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something to chew on, if the Earth and sky really do bear witness to recent, terrifying global events described in ancient texts but seemingly repressed from our collective conscious memory, in what other ways might that buried trauma, that inherited fear of cosmic chaos, be shaping our world, our anxieties, our conflicts, and our behavior today, completely beneath our conscious awareness?
It's a question that moves beyond the scientific evidence and the very nature of the human condition itself, doesn't it? How much of our present is dictated by a past we refuse to remember?
Indeed. A lot to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks everyone. We'll see you next time.